We're going to get started with our next talk of the day and our first teleconference talk of this conference. Tal, unfortunately, had some last minute things come up and couldn't be here with us today, but very generously decided to submit to having his talk given in this kind of disembodied format, which is awesome for us. Tal Yarkoni is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Texas in Austin. He's done an influential body of work related to structure function mapping in the human brain, the improvement of statistical inferences in functional MRI, large-scale informatics efforts for reproducible science in neuroimaging, and in connection with our conference theme, he's done work on cognitive ontology, both developing things like NeuroVault and the Cognitive Atlas to sort of track our cognitive ontologies, and also figuring out how we can leverage big data and neuroimaging to say new things about mental constructs. But today he's going to talk to us about why do we need a cognitive ontology anyway.
All right, thanks. I'll share my slides in a second. I apologize for not being able to be there. I'm really not good at life. So I closed on the house yesterday and moved today. And somehow I thought initially that I could still be there while this was all happening, but it turns out that's not the case. So I seem a little frazzled because I am, but I'll try to make the best of it. Yeah, it's really a shame. I see some familiar faces through the video, so hope I get to catch up with some of you some other time. So let me share the screen here. All right, and normally I like to take questions during the talk, but I'll just take the deafening silence, in this case is approval, the whole way through. So I want to talk about what cognitive ontologies are good for. I guess I'm not sure if there have been other talks already. I guess I didn't have a chance to look at the schedule. I know Russ is going to be talking later, and I think this probably will be sort of a nice, I think you'll get sort of two different flavors. A lot of the sort of the data that we I think we're going to talk about are similar, but we have slightly different perspectives on the implications. So let me start by just kind of laying out what I mean by an ontology. And so I think many of you are philosophers, and so if you want to be clear, as you probably all recognize, there are sort of two notions of ontology. This is sort of the definition that pops up on Google when you plug in ontology, which I always like to do just to make sure I'm not completely off base when I start talking about something. So obviously, if you're a philosopher and you call yourself an ontologist, you probably think of yourself as like studying, what it means to say things exist, how we, know if they exist, what exists, which is quite different from sort of what scientists and informaticians say when they say that they're building ontologies, where the idea is really just to lay out the units, if you like, the set of concepts that are sort of key to the discipline and articulate sort of what the space is, how to slice it up basically, and what the relationships are between the sort of entities that you're positing. And I'm going to focus exclusively on the second one, so I'll have essentially nothing to say about anything metaphysical. Of course, if you have questions and you think some relations, feel free to bring them up. But I sort of take cognitive ontology here to mean sort of trying to articulate a sort of a map, if you like, of the territory of cognition. So what would it mean to say that we've identified sort of meaningful units of cognition, and how do they relate to each other, their properties, etc. There's a sense in which you could argue that actually all scientists are ontologists. Right? I mean, almost every scientific work expresses a partial ontology in the sense that every scientist has to introduce the variables, the entities that they're talking about. And of course, in some sense, whatever your philosophical position on the reality of these things, there's a sense in which, in order to be able to talk about the relationship between things, I must accept that I sort of have some implicit ontology that says these are the units that I'm really talking about. So to some degree, really every theoretical discussion in any kind of science, I think, is partly driven by some implicit ontology. But some scientists, or most scientists, I think, are only interested in ontology to the degree that it helps them sort of identify the things they want to talk about. And then there's some people who sort of have the drive to sort of collect the full set, right? And are interested in maybe not drilling down on like one particular question, but asking at this level of description, what is sort of the full-blown ontology? We identify sort of the full spectrum of entities that we need in order to talk about the sort of sciences domain in and of itself. And there's lots of examples of this. So this is, oops, what happened here? Oh, that's odd. Probably the best example is this, right? So this is the periodic table of the elements, which in a sense is an ontology. If you're a chemist, this tells you sort of what the core entities are that you are going to be working with, at least at some levels of chemistry. And these things can sort of have interesting interactions, you can study the relationship between them, and occasionally we add a new one. Sometimes we even argue something shouldn't be in there, or the order is reversed or something. But by and large, this is sort of pretty static, right? And there's very little controversy about, these days at least, about what this represents. And you find this sort of thing in chemistry, and you sort of, again, there's not really much sort of a debate that this is a fundamental thing you have to kind of accept as a starting point. To some degree, you see similar things as you go up the level. So in molecular biology, you still have lots of ontologies and lots of sort of fairly well laid out structures. So here's, I think, sort of a graph showing you, this is from the gene ontology, alpha amylase inhibitor activity at the bottom there. And you can see that you have this nice map of relationships. You have all these other entities on there. You have catalytic activity and hydrolase activity acting on glycosyl and all kinds of things. And you have relationships. So you can see that alpha amylase inhibitor activity negatively regulates alpha amylase activity and so on. And there are probably controversies about many of these edges and probably some of the nodes, but by and large, you're talking about science at this fairly low level, you still have a lot of structure that seems good. I mean, people, I'm not saying there aren't controversies, but it's less fuzzy. Right? The lower down you go in the hierarchy of science, the sort of the cleaner the entities look, at least at first approximation. So I think many people in psychology and in neuroimaging and sort of higher level fields look at these kind of things and say, well, that's nice, we want that. And we would like to have something like this. This is from a paper with Russ a couple of years ago. And the idea is that, if you try to imagine what this would look like in psychology, you might have something broadly that looks like this. You would have, you can think of sort of the concept you work with up here, right? So you can think of something like cognitive control. It's a pretty broad concept. Maybe it's a part of working memory, so working memory is a separate node. You can think of central executive episodic buffer, so on, components of working memory. And then you can think of these sort of concepts as being measured by, so you might introduce this measured by relation. You can have tasks, and so now you have a phonological similarity task. You can have different experimental conditions, and so on. And the idea is you're laying out this sort of structure, this nomological network of all the things you want to talk about, think are useful to talk about in psychology, and articulate how they relate to one another. So that's sort of I think the objective in some sense, or for some people at least, that's the ideal, is to have this sort of working map of psychology, of if you cognitive neuroimaging, and so on. And part of the appeal of this kind of thing, I think, is the promise that this could bring clarity, right? So again, much more so than in fields like chemistry, physics, etc. I think that there's really there's a lot of fuzziness that occurs when scientists working in psychology or cognitive neuroscience interact with one another. It turns out people use terms differently. It's not always clear what the sort of the scope of one model is, how it relates to someone else's model, and you might want to say, well, look, instead of maybe everyone using their own language, maybe we should try and sort of impose some kind of discipline so that people have an easier time understanding what they're talking about. Right? Maybe we should settle on one particular set of terms, which of course raises the question, like, which set of terms and how do we actually identify those terms? And there's different intuitions, but I think probably the most common one is something like the following. Well, if you want an ontology, and you want kind of a map of the discipline, probably it'd be a good idea to introduce terms, concepts, entities that carve nature at its joints. And so I think philosophers sometimes, or used to at least, like to talk about natural kinds, things that are sort of more natural categories that maybe get sort of given to us as opposed to introduced by humans. And even if you don't like natural kinds, you might still think there are some stronger regularities than others, and maybe that's what we should strive for, so to identify units in our ontology that map cleanly, as cleanly as possible, onto what's out there in the world. So, okay, how do we do this? And what I'm going to argue in probably the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll try to convince you that actually we can't really do this. Right? It's actually probably kind of a lost cause. But I'll walk you through the logic and why I think it doesn't work so well. Broadly speaking, I think there's sort of like two ways to approach this, and I'm obviously simplifying, but you could think about, let's say, three ways, but really two. So one is you could sort of go super top down, and you could just sort of reify folk psychology. You could start by saying, look, people already kind of know what's important. They use terms, they clearly pick things out of the world, they do some work for us, so let's just stick with those and see how far you can get with an ontology based on things like anger and attention and language and so on. I'm not going to recite the various reasons why this is probably not terribly helpful, but it isn't. I mean, there's a sense in which if we stop at sort of what we started out with, and it's not clear what the sort of goal of having a formal psychology is, right? We kind of already have these terms. Ideally, we want to move beyond this and say something more precise than just, so-and-so is paying attention, or, I feel angry. I mean, we would like to articulate something maybe a little more mechanistic and precise than that. But still, you could argue, a lot of the approaches we've adopted these kinds of problems are still sort of top-down approaches in the sense that we start from a given understanding of psychology and what we think is important in psychology, and then we just kind of reify those concepts. So we say, well, look, working memory is a thing, right? We have to respect the fact that working memory is a concept we want to stick around, so that's got to go in our ontology, and then we can start asking questions about what the components of working memory, what task measuring working memory, but we're not going to give that up. It's unlikely that we would decide as a result of some investigation, well, it turns out we were wrong, working memory was just not a thing. So in some sense, the idea is we sort of start with, we have some theoretical reasons to privilege some concepts, whether they be folk reasons or as we've been studying the domain for a long time, we think we understand what's going on. But we have sort of priors in some sense. The alternative is to come at this from a bottom-up perspective, to say, look, here's the sort of the space, kind of identify the phenomena we're interested in. Maybe it's all of cognition, but maybe it's something more narrow, the methods we want to use, etc. So we identify sort of the space we're interested in, and we say, let's take measurements of that space as comprehensively as possible, and then we'll do some really clever statistical analysis, conceptual analysis, and we'll sort of identify the natural boundaries of entities. So we'll basically let the data talk to us, right? We won't sort of impose our own notion of what's going on in there. We'll sort of do some decomposition of all this data, and out will pop out some, truth about how things are related to, what are the dimensions and how do they relate to one another. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive. You could sort of go back and forth. It's an iterative approach that sort of integrates top-down and bottom approaches. But broadly speaking, those are sort of the two general directions in which you can try and identify sort of what is there in the world that we should care about. I will take as an example for the rest of the way, one particular area which I've done some work in, and sort of I would say has swallowed up maybe like half the field of cognitive neuroscience for the last 10 years, which is decomposition of fMRI data. And it's sort of very much in this spirit of the bottom-up approach. Cognitive neuroscience really love these decomposition methods. So the idea here is, the core idea, and I'm maybe being a little uncharitable, but not that much, I don't think. The core idea is that fMRI data looks like this really high-dimensional thing, but it only looks at it, right? So if you naively take an fMRI data set, sure, it looks like you have maybe 200,000 voxels, and maybe you're measuring each of those 1,000 times, 1,000 points in time, and you're doing 20 subjects. So this is a really high-dimensional data set if you think that each of these data points is sort of its own little world, it's completely independent of the other. But of course it's not. So the idea is this is just sort of, it's in some sense an illusion, right? Sort of it's a naive view of the world, but really the actual real structure, what's actually generating the observed data is a much lower dimensional structure, right? So there's some low dimensional manifold hidden within that massive amount of data. And our goal really is to take that massive amount of data and by applying clever methods, extract that low dimensional real quote-unquote structure. And then we can say we've actually understood something. We've gone from this like billion dimension space to something much more manageable. So that's the kind of idea that drives, I don't know if it's the only idea, but it's certainly a big driver of a lot of work in cognitive neuroscience over the last 10 or so years. And I'll show you just a few examples. This is a seminal study, a joint collaboration between Steve Smith's group at Oxford, the Climate group, and BrainMap. And what they did was take a resting state data set, resting state data set, where subjects are in the scanner, not doing anything in particular, just hanging out. And they looked at functional connectivity between, so they took connectivity between every point of the brain, every other point, and they did independent component analysis on that connectivity matrix. So the idea is they're pulling out components that are statistically independent of one another. And they pulled out, I think, like 20 components. And then they did the same thing in a very different data set, brain map data set, which is a meta-analytic database of, I think at the time, around 1,000 studies, and same procedure. And what they showed, quite compellingly, I think, is that you can actually line up components that look very, very similar. So you extract 20 from the resting state, 20 from brain map data set, and lo and behold, so our RSN here on the left is resting state, VM is brain map, and you can see, I mean, these are sort of, they carry them manually, right? But you can see that like these look very similar. So here's a visual component. Actually, here's another visual component, is sort of an infertemporal object detection component, and so on. And these, if you are used to looking at brain data, these actually look, by and large, quite interpretable, at least the first few of them do. And so the argument is like you get these very stable components across these two very different kinds of data. They are simple, they're interpretable, they explain quite a bit of variance. And then if you project them onto functional space, because brain map, you actually know what the studies in the database were, so you can actually say, well, hey, what kind of functions are these, is this cluster associated with? Then you can pull out some nice structure and say, well, look, this network number one over here looks like a vision. So these three components load highly on vision terms, but not so much on other kinds of tasks. And so this looks really compelling. Right? You have stability, you have sort of sensible mappings, and so you might look at this and say, well, great, we learned something really important about the brain. That's the structure. So now we can develop an ontology that has maybe these 10 networks, and we can sort of map them onto the tasks we've identified, and that's a pretty good start. Just so I can stick my name somewhere in this talk, here's a sort of a much more focal analysis of the medial frontal cortex, which Alejandro de la Vega at my lab did a couple years ago. We took a database called Neuroscience we've developed, which is another meta-analytic database, and applied clustering methods to kind of identify at different spatial scales distinct subdivisions of the medial frontal cortex. So here you have sort of 3 divisions. You get the sort of posterior one, a middle one, an anterior one. But if you want sort of a sort of finer-grained analysis, then these things start to break up. And if you then ask, well, do these actually have different functional roles? The answer is yes. We can sort of look at kind of very similar to the brain map analysis. What do these different sort of zones, these 3 zones, and so here's 1, 2, 3, and then these subzones within that do. And the only kind of point I want to know, if you look here at the 3 main zones, you can see that they are sort of associated with different things to some degree, which right, looks like this green one sort of loads more strongly on reward, side memory, social processing. This red one turns more on memory, conflict, inhibition, etc. It's not a really clean association, but there's some preferential structure there. So that's another example. Here's just another example from Simon Ockhoff's group. This is, I believe this is, I actually don't remember. I should look this up recently. But it's a morcellation of the insula, and the only point I want to make is you end up with what looks very reasonable. And if you study the insula, you might say, oh yeah, well, we know that there's sort of this functional division between the anterior insula and the posterior one. Posterior more sensory pain processes, anterior more affective. And that makes sense. It's nice that you get that falling out of this sort of data-driven clustering. So again, you might say, good, now we understand the structure of these. You might look at all these things and say, well, that's nice, but each of these things is still based on like just one modality, typically functional MRI. Really, if you really want to capture, if you want to carve each joint, you should really try to find mappings between different approaches, right? So what about anatomical divisions? Can you find mappings between anatomical divisions and fMRI and the MEG and so on? And so you could imagine like a parcellation approach that tries to kind of simultaneously optimize for multiple modalities, and that's what this sort of, I would say, current favorite Glasser approach from the Human Connectome Project does. Not going to get into details, but you get this very nice, I want to say like 200, 240 or something clusters. And this is supposed to reflect sort of multiple modalities. It's not that you're just taking functional connectivity, analyzed one way and saying, aha, here's the ground truth. You actually have sort of something that's in some sense optimizing for multiple levels of analysis, multiple methods. So maybe this is a little better, right? Now this is sort of approximating the actual space of what the brain is doing better, maybe. And there's literally thousands of these studies in there, just picking out semi-randomly examples. And they sort of start to repeat very quickly. So there's like literally dozens of parcellations of the insula. There's probably hundreds of parcellations of the whole brain. And you can, I think, build a very nice career. And you will have just constructing factories that do, this region today, that region next week, and so on. One question I think that we should ask ourselves, though, with this kind of work is, are we actually explaining anything, or are these just convenient descriptions? Right? So you have this high-dimensional structure, the brain, and you extract some low-dimensional representation, and then we tend to talk about this in our articles as we're discovering latent structures that are actually sort of the ground truth in some sense, right? This is actually the true hidden structure, and the only reason it looks high-dimensional is because you have sampling error and measurement error and all kinds of noise. But really, the structure we should care about is this sort of very low-dimensional thing embedded. Could even be like 20, maybe 50 dimensions for the whole brain, maybe 3 or 4 functional units for fairly large chunks of tissue, like the insula. And that would be really nice if that were true, because it would make our life much simpler. But I would say that's not the case, right? It's not the case that we're actually, there's a sense in which there's latent structure there, but there's lots of latent structure. And the ground truth really is that high-dimensional structure. It's not, you could say that these low-dimensional structures are real, and they're really not, but they're real only like the Bennett, like Bill Patten sense. Like there's lots of ways to describe a high-dimensional structure. And I don't think I have, actually no, I do have a simulation, and I'll show it momentarily. But the general principle here is if you have a very complex causal process, and at least some of the sort of structures that are involved in that process are correlated in some way or interacting, it is almost guaranteed, actually it's basically guaranteed that there will be low-dimensional reductions that can capture much of that variation. Often they'll capture a lot of the variation using a relatively small number of dimensions, but that doesn't in any sense mean that you've sort of captured the sort of actual underlying process. You just have an approximation, and there's generally many approximations that will do roughly as well. So by definition, it's not the true model, so it can only be an approximation and usually approximate the truth in many different ways. They look quite different, but are all actually fairly interpretable. And there's a sense in which the kinds of clustering approaches I showed you, again, this is not, there's lots of other kinds of analyses you could do. I don't suggest that this is sort of the only place this applies, but it's a nice way, it's a nice example that you can, I think, argue for very simple reasons that these kind of things cannot possibly be good approximations of the true data generating process, whatever else their utility. They can't be good approximations of the DGP. Why? Well, for one thing, it's just wildly implausible to think that millions of neurons, right, so every voxel is billions of neurons, and it's just not possible to think that each, all these neurons are doing, roughly the same thing. Right? That's what we know from electrophysiological studies. That's not the case. In fact, you can find within the same very local chunk of tissue neurons that have very different response properties. They might have some family resemblance, but it's unlikely that this kind of parcellation that forces voxels to into the same clusters as their neighbors is actually representing the actual high-dimensional space in which the brain lives. And there are also kind of other issues you can raise, like even if this were true, if there was this sort of one-to-one mapping from voxels to clusters, how would we know how many clusters to pick? Right? I mean, it's a fairly arbitrary question. I'll come back a little later to some things you can do to try and answer this question. But suffice to say, it's fairly arbitrary. There's not really good principal reasons to say, well, we want 10 clusters versus 20 versus 300. And there's also this question you can ask, like, fine if you just want sort of a convenient way to carve up the brain, great. But if you start out by being interested, as some cognitive neuroscientists do start by wanting a cognitive ontology, right? Then the assumption you're making with something like this is, well, if we start from the brain and carve it up into 200 chunks, all we have to do is project it back into cognitive space and we'll know what each of these things does. And there's not an obvious reason why there has to be a clean mapping between units extracted at one level of description and sort of meaningful concepts or entities at another level of description. Right? In fact, think probably most watch regarded as that would be a weird thing in some sense, right? There was sort of a clean isomorphic mapping between different levels of description. It would be nice, but that seems like an odd kind of approach. If you really are interested in cognition, maybe you should start with the brain. Maybe you should start at least something that respects cognitive divisions we care about. So let me illustrate kind of more visually what the actual sort of root problem is here. So what you're seeing here is, on the left, just a simple simulation, and the left here is what I'm calling the ground truth. So imagine that each color in this figure is a different population of neurons, and you have a simple two-dimensional brain. If you really had sort of these, I think I have like 10 different types of neurons here. If you really have this sort of nice, compact spatial distribution, so these are all Gaussians, and they're fairly far apart for the most part, this is sort of an easy problem to solve with clustering. Right? So if you take this data, you strip the actual true labels and you just submit it to K-means clustering algorithm, which is probably the most common clustering algorithm. You can see, you say, because you have to tell these things how many clusters you want, you say, give me 5 clusters, you see that you get something very sensible. So because you asked for 5, and we know hypothetically, or by hypothesis is actually 10, of course it's going to have to combine some of these things, but you can see that beyond that it gets a structure right. So yes, it combines things together. And down here you can see, so given the assigned clusters by color, what are the, what proportion of the true neuron types fall within? So you can see that like this one is actually capturing 4 different sort of true types of neurons, but at least there's sort of no, it's not splitting any of them in half or anything, right? So it's just sort of taking supersets, combining multiple sets of true neurons into the sort of types. If you'd asked for 10 clusters, then you see it looks pretty good, and you can actually really quite close, although in one case at least you'll see it does this funny thing where it splits like one cluster into. And these clustering approaches, to emphasize, have to give you an answer. They can't say, sorry, I don't know what to do with this, it doesn't look like something in a cluster. They'll always give you an answer. And generally speaking, if the data looks like this on the left, then the answer will be pretty good. And you will look at this and say, yeah, it looks like there's a lot of specificity. Here's this cluster, and if you imagine you could map this on a function, you might say, oh, look, all these things are doing the same thing. So you have these sort of nice profiles at the bottom. But that's really an ideal situation. This is not real data. I mean, it's not even realistic data. Imagine you have sort of bad data, right? So maybe now the ground truth is this on the left. And now there's actually a bunch of spatial overlap. So one way to think about it is the neurons actually live in 3 dimensions. They can be stacked on top of each other, which is certainly true again in the brain, think of voxels. But our methods have no way of inferring that 3rd dimension in this case, and so you get this thing here if you ask for 5 clusters. It still looks really good. Like if you didn't know the ground truth, you'd look at this and say there's lots of structure here. Right? This is functionally different from this thing. You can see these profiles here still look quite different. Right? So some of these like this cluster has this sort of, it's really just picking up on these 2 types of things and so on. And this is like, still unrealistic data. Maybe the actual data looks more like this, where things are really sort of packed in and overlaid on top of one another. Good luck trying to cluster this, or good luck trying to recover the actual structure with sort of clustering approaches. This, I would say, as ugly as this is still like completely idealized. Like in the real world, there's just no scenario in which you have just these sort of 10 discrete types. You would have multiple layers, these things are interacting with each other in different ways. There are all kinds of dynamics, and there's no way you're going to actually get anywhere near the true distribution of, if you like, neuron types using these kinds of approaches. So, just to make it clear, if the ground truth is this thing up here, this is what we're actually seeing. Right? What you actually look at and you get data out of the scanner, and this is true, it doesn't mean scanner, behavioral data, anything else, is something like this. Your job is basically to infer the data generating process, however complex it might be, for something that looks like this. And then you apply some clustering algorithms, you get like an answer, and it looks like a reasonable answer because there's lots of structure. But the thing to remember is, if you rerun this clustering algorithm, you get a slightly different answer. Could be actually quite a different answer. In other words, you would get sort of cuts that go through different places, but because there's so much high-dimensional structure there will always be some specificity. You'll always look at the kind of the joints you're targeting and say, look, that's doing something different from this other here. So it's very easy to tell a story, and you're not really fooling yourself. There really is structure there, but you're not really appreciating the gap between the structure that you see and the actual complexity of the data generating process. So, so we can't assume that because we get sort of a nice answer, the actual process was actually really simple. You might say, okay, can we fix these kinds of assumptions? Right, so this clustering assumption is bad, maybe we can get around that. So let's say we want to do two things. We want to avoid this discrete voxel cluster assignment and use something more probabilistic. We map sort of voxels onto regions probabilistically, so we're not sort of, we don't have to say like, oh yes, this one goes in cluster 1, this one goes in cluster 7, but we can say there's some probability, some proportion of the neurons in this voxel are doing one thing or another. And you might also want to come up with a model that simultaneously respects both cognitive and neurobiological constraints at the same time. So the argument here is we're trying to get sort of a more biologically plausible model of how function might be sort of carved up in the brain/mind. And so this kind of approach has been explored. Let me just skip this. So here's one nice study from Thomas Yo's group a few years ago. And the kind of insight here was, well, maybe instead of going straight from the brain to sort of task labels or something, we could posit the sort of what they call cognitive components. There's like a latent level of description in between. And the idea is that these sort of have many mappings. The cognitive component can be involved in many tasks, and it can map onto multiple brain regions. And I won't go into the details of the model, but the idea is you get something like this. It's a probabilistic generative model, and you get out things that look like this, and you can say, aha, now we have these 12 components, and you can see these components are sort of distributed in the brain. They actually don't look very much like classical brain regions or networks at all. And so they sort of, every component sort of maps onto multiple regions, and also onto multiple tasks. So they kind of took the brain map database and showed nicely that they sort of project these cognitive components into both spaces, both brain space and cognitive space. And so now one argument you could make is good. Now we have the structure. So this is what we should use in our ontology. We have these 12 components, and we don't need to talk about individual voxels or even tasks. This is sort of a nice intermediate level of analysis. Now, one limitation of this, though, is you might say, well, okay, but like these things really don't look brain-like at all. Like, these are not clusters that make any sense to most people. I think they make some sense, but they sort of are not parsimonious from a theoretical standpoint. Can we come up with some even better constraints? Can we say, like, well, we want something like this, but we want to constrain the spatial distribution. So if they look, maybe they have sort of bilateral homologs, so if it's on the left, it should also be to some degree showing up on the right side of the brain in the same place. And maybe you want to constrain the spatial distribution, so you can't just get blobs everywhere. They have to be sort of one focal blob that can be sort of stretched out in various directions. And so some colleagues and I, and Russ Boldrack as well, last year published this paper, which in some ways turns out very similar to the LLL study, but imposes additional spatial constraints. So now we're sort of really trying to push this idea. We think, a more biologically plausible model actually constrains the space of these units, so they're not just sort of free-floating, show up anywhere in the brain. And this is meant to impress you. This is the late notation of this model. It's a fairly complex model. One point is you end up with this when you fit it to this gigantic Neuroscience database. You now get things that look much more modular, so you have sort of most of these regions show nice bilateral homologs. So here's the amygdala, for instance, is striatum, and I won't get into details, but the point is that these look, I think, a lot more like what most cognitive scientists would say they expect out of meaningful brain units. They look a lot more region-like. But the point to note here is it's not anatomically constrained in any of these things. They're still sort of driven entirely by the data in some sense, with the idea that there's sort of a small prior, there's a spatial constraint. And so you end up with an alternative way of representing this mapping from concepts on the one hand to brain activity on the other. So, and one thing that's nice is it's probabilistic, so you can see that these things now actually spatially overlap. So we're not forcing every voxel into a box, right? So you can have, in posterior parietal cortex, for instance, you have these sort of what we call topics that are sort of associated with overlapping spatial distributions and terms, but they're sort of also reasonably distinct, which I think is sort of a more realistic way to look at what's going on here. I'll skip all this in terms of time. So this is it, right? So you should be convinced now that all the stuff that came before is no good because it has these sort of very strong assumptions that are clearly false. But now we have this model. We have 100 topics that are based on a probabilistic generative model that are reasonable assumptions. I didn't talk about this, but you can use this to encode and decode brain activity. You can actually accurately reconstruct virtually any other map you want. You can sort of express any pattern of activity reasonably accurately using these sort of 100 units, with a kind of like a basis that you can combine to get almost any, at least coarse-grained pattern of activity. So I would like us all, of course, to follow the final neurocognitive ontology, and then we can all go home and move on. Right? No, not so much. I mean, I like this study. I think it's nice, and in some ways it's really sort of proof of concept that if you have sort of stronger notions about what constraints you care about theoretically, you should build those into the model. You should make the model respect the spatial constraints you think are important, and you should try to maybe estimate components based on both semantics and both psychology and sort of patterns of activity at the same time. But there's still tons of fundamental limitations. We're fixing the number of topics. You know, why do these spatial constraints have to be Gaussian? That's kind of weird. Why do they have to? Why do you impose with hemispheric symmetry? These are all sort of really bad constraints, and they're clearly not actually realistic. The starting point is random, so if you rerun the model, you'll end up with actually fairly different looking topics. They'll still look wonderful, and they'll be interpretable, but they'll be different. Is that a problem? I don't know, might be. And all of this, I didn't really talk about this in this talk, but all this is based on a weird data set that sort of automatically extracts meaning from text via like abstract words, which is really a very poor representation of what's going on. So the data, you could argue, are really sort of poor quality. So this is nothing approximating here. There's no sense in which what I just showed you, I mean, it relaxes some really absurd assumptions, I think, of other models, but it makes its own crazy assumptions, and it's nothing close to an approximation of the high-dimensional true data-generating process. It's just a convenient description, it's just a more convenient description. Well, I shouldn't say that. Is it an improvement? Maybe, and it depends on what your goals are, what assumptions you care about. So I think under assumptions, if you care about respecting reasonable spatial constraints on what sort of functional units should look like, maybe it's an improvement. You don't care about that, then this might not be worth your while at all. Maybe the other kinds of approaches I showed you are more or better. If you don't care about psychology at all, why should you care about estimating something jointly with semantics? Right? You should just look at brain activity by itself. So there's no sense in which these things are sort of just good or bad. They're good or bad depending on what your goals are and what assumptions you're willing to make. And this kind of gets me to the main point I want to make. Actually, let me kind of, I don't know if the mic is on, but how much time do I have? 45 minutes? Can somebody put up like thumbs up if yes?
Yes, that's fine.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So I will. That's good. I'll just breeze through what I have left to say. There's this notion, right, that all models are wrong. Some are useful. Ontologies are a kind of model. So this is true of ontologies too. Like there's no sense in which we should think that we're really sort of capturing reality as it truly is. And none of the examples I've shown in those arguing that nothing in the field, period, is really a serious attempt to approximate the data-generating process as closely as possible. We do things very differently if that was our goal. So the question then really is, what are we doing? What makes an ontology, any sort of parcellation or sort of division of some field good or less, better or worse, essentially, than another one? And if we're going to go with kind of Fox's view, maybe we shouldn't talk about sort of right or wrong, but at least what makes one more or less useful. And I wanted to real quickly go through several possible criteria. It's not exhaustive, but really the point I want to make is it's actually really, really hard when you're talking about field as fuzzy as psychology to answer this kind of question. It's not clear that you can actually do it in a meaningful way. So here are several things real quickly you could care about. You might say, well, consistency is important, right? If I have a division of, let's say, let's stick with clustering, have these 100 clusters, they should show up over and over again when looking at data sets and populations, and stability is important. And the intuition is that real things should show up over and over again, no matter what method you're using. And so there are lots of approaches to this problem, and some of the, actually most of the studies I showed you, people do have used quantitative metrics that look at stability of clustering solutions. For example, a study by Yao et al., they estimated the number of networks, and you can see that some are better than others. So the idea is that these kind of local minima here look like they're more stable. And so maybe you want to pick those. Maybe 7 is a good number, but 15 is not because it's unstable. And if you pull out 7 and 17 and look at them, it turns out, hey, look, these look quite stable. I mean, actually, they're really stable. So you take the discovery sample, you can nicely replicate the structure, and it's very tempting to say, okay, this must be something real, right? Because, I mean, look, it replicates really nicely across samples. It's highly stable. It's compelling. However, Stability is not actually that big a deal. For one thing, there's literally hundreds of consistency and stability metrics. So, and they don't generally agree with each other. So you could basically, if you want to do a comprehensive job, you'd probably pick 20 metrics, run them all, and they would turn out like 5 of these favor a 4-cluster solution, 5 of them favor a 7-cluster solution, and generally there's no good way to reconcile these. But really the more kind of fundamental problem is consistency is neither necessary nor sufficient for carving nature at the joints, whatever that means, right? So it's not necessary because it's just a statistical fact that if you have a high-dimensional process, the true data-generating process is high-dimensional, and you have finite data, then you're not going to fit the data well. In other words, the true process itself will not fit the data well if you don't have a huge amount of data. And so clearly you can have the right model without consistency, at least in any way that you can estimate it in finite data. It's also not sufficient because you can have a stable low-dimensional representation that tells absolutely nothing, or at least very little, I should say, about the DGP. For example, a classic example is you take a data set of 300 car models, you have people rate them on all kinds of attributes, you do a principal components analysis, you are guaranteed to recapture a small number of components that explain a huge amount of variance in those 300 dimensions. It'll probably be stable if you sample 300 other car models. What is it telling you about how to build a car, how to understand a car? Essentially nothing, right? Your first component is going to be something like size. So we described the superficial structure of cars given those particular inputs, but that's not a model of the actual, it's not an explanation of what actually generates variation in car attributes. So consistency not sufficient is or necessary. You could opt for model comparison. You might say, well, let's do statistical model comparison. Give me 2 models, and I will pick the one that fits the data better. This seems really nice and objective. People like this because it sort of seems like scientific. Like there's no need for nasty subjectivity. The data is just going to tell you, hey, this model fits the data better, and we can penalize the model because it's more complex, so there's all kinds of ways to penalize for complexity. And then you get an answer that says, oh yes, model A fits the data better than B. So any number of examples of this is common enough from my data. For example, you could say there's competing 1 versus 2 parameter models of various forms of decision making, and you kind of look at brain activity and say, well, is it better fit by a 1 parameter model or a 2 parameter model? And if the 1 parameter model fits better, you say, good. Now we think that this is a better description of this is more likely to capture the actual process by which people make decisions. But that's not super compelling either for many reasons. This is a whole other topic, but just briefly, in most cases in psychology, the space of plausible models is enormous, right? It's not like there's really just 2 plausible models. Like you don't stop at 1 and 2 parameter models. You could come up with all kinds of 6 parameter models that are perfectly plausible as models of decision making. And the space of tested models is usually very small. So the fact that A is much better than B does not in any shape or form mean that A is actually a good model. It could be utterly terrible. It's just better comparatively. So one model can kick another model in ass and head-to-head competition, but it's quite useless for anything that you could actually do with that model predictively. I'm also more worried, I guess, about the fact that, so this seems like an objective approach, but models differ in all kinds of dimensions that typically don't actually play any part of the formal comparison. So model A might be more theoretically parsimonious, more generalizable, more novel, and these considerations count for something, but they're not actually ever included, or very rarely, in that actually statistical apparatus that gives you an answer. So we can't integrate these to form a summary judgment about what we prefer. So we almost never see things like this in papers. Model A fits the data a bit better than Model B, but A is dumb, so we still prefer Model B. That should be a perfectly reasonable thing to say, right? I mean, it should be reasonable to say, look, if Model A only slightly fits the data better than B, but there's all these other reasons to prefer B, we prefer B. But we never see this, because I think the intuition is this is objective. What about generativity in the sense of making novel predictions? We like that in science. We think making predictions is good. And I think that's true in fields like physics, where you really can set up some competitions between quantum mechanics can explain essentially everything that Newtonian mechanics can, but the converse is not true. So good, quantum mechanics is a better theory in some sense. That kind of thing doesn't happen though in psychology. Models are rarely mutually exclusive. If you find support for ontology A or model A, all that implies is that A is useful. It doesn't have to imply that, but at best it says that A is useful. That doesn't say much of anything about B. They are both useful. They just are talking about slightly different things, right? They might overlap 98% of the time. In 1% of the time, A talks about different things, and B talks about different things. But rarely is it the case that models actually directly conflict. You don't get critical experiments of entire ontologies. That's just not going to happen. And I think this is kind of like a touching view that, like, even when people think they have critical experiments, it's usually fairly trivial to say, no, you're not actually threatening my theory of working memory. I don't think about working memory and start calling executive control. You're talking about something slightly different, so I can just tweak these auxiliary assumptions and everything's fine. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I think that's a very reasonable thing to do because the scope of models in psychology, certainly in ontologies, will tend to overlap for the most part. So the clustering schemes are coextensive in the sense that they all cover up the entire brain. Okay, another thing you can say is aesthetic preference. This clearly is one of the dominant reasons scientists actually choose the models they choose, right? But you can't actually admit this in papers. You can't say, well, I just like this, it appeals to me. So this is why we come with silly objective metrics, which is unfortunate. This also includes the toothbrush problem, right? So they've heard this idea that, like, nobody wants to use everyone else's theory, right? Just like toothbrushes. So you have to come up with your own model, even if it's essentially the same as someone else. Like I could have said for the first time of this talk, just go read Bennett's patterns, and that's all I have to say, which is true. But I didn't, because this way I get to give the talk and take some credit for something. So, there are other reasons to come up with new models. So I do think this is a perfectly reasonable thing to actually percolate. It's just that it's very hard to know what to do with that. It's almost not science at that point. Let's get this in interest time. The last kind of point I want to argue is predictive utility. And this one I think is one that people really like as a way of arbitrating between different models. So maybe all that other stuff is really hard to pull apart. But surely, right, surely we can at least say that models should be able to do something if they're good. So a good model should have to predict some, maybe not important, but some real world outcome. There should be some objective indicator that this model does something that another model can't. And it feels like I can classify autism with 97% accuracy is a more useful thing for a model to say than just, well, you know what, autism is associated with a difference in global brain volume, p less than 0.05. Right? You don't really know much of anything about the world if you know the latter. The former seems actually a very important thing to say. So I mean, other people are arguing that the psychologists probably do undervalue prediction quite a bit and overvalue explanation. However, I don't think this actually solves this particular problem, right? So if causal identification is the goal, if you're trying to identify sort of causal joints out in the world, maybe prediction is necessary sometimes. I don't even think that's true, but it's certainly not sufficient. And the reason is because in practice, models with very different interpretations often form conflict. I actually wish I had more time to show you some examples, but the general principle here, you have to take my word for it, is that for most sort of big problems, it turns out that more complex and interpretable models just do better predictive. Right? So the idea that you're going to have like a simple, intuitive model that does the same work as a sort of horrifically uninterpretable 25-layer deep network is probably not realistic. In most domains where we have sort of hard problems like object recognition, natural language, there's no real reason, I think, to think that we'll actually have sort of simple insights into what these kind of networks are doing. You probably understand things a little better than we do, but fundamentally we have this choice, I think. Do you want a simple description and you sacrifice prediction, or do you just live with the fact that there's no reason to think that a simple cognitive ontology will actually do the best job of predicting stuff? You have a choice, and you have to pick one of these things. So what I want to kind of argue is that the bottom line is reality is overrated. Right? So I think trying to arbitrate between different neurocognitive ontologies, I think, is a difficult and probably largely useless proposition. I don't like the question of what is real. There is structure out there. There's high-dimensional structure. There are different ways to describe it. Some are better than others for different purposes. But it's not like we're ever going to get to sort of like, this is the right model, is the right way to think about cognition. And that is just looking at working memory. That's just a useless way to think about things. Executive control is it? It's more productive, I think, to look at ontologies as slightly different, but mostly interchangeable basis sets. In mathematical sense, you can sort of generate, you can approximate all kinds of functions given a very large number of basis sets, or a small set of functions that you can combine in different ways. Or even maybe different languages is another way to think about it. So you can translate between languages, but you can also still capture more or less the same stuff with every language. The pragmatic view, of course, is cognitive ontologies at the end of the day, like most ontologies, are just tools. They provide not unique ways of organizing the fields of knowledge. At their best, they act like ontologies in the informatic sense, which is to say, best case scenarios, they're actually machine-readable representations of scientific ideas. Like, it would be really nice if we can actually represent what psychologist A thinks when they're talking to psychologist B in like a structured file that the machine can read and say, aha, I understand what you're saying, and I can actually extrapolate from this and identify other interesting predictions, etc. So I'll just end with this quote from this chapter that Russ and I wrote. which I think summarizes my thinking about this pretty nicely. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, one can think of a good ontology as a kind of universal language that dramatically reduces the likelihood of miscommunication between researchers by enabling statements to be defined in more formal and less ambiguous terms, even when the mapping between terms and reference is still not perfect. I'll add it probably can't be perfect. At their best, good ontologies can serve as sophisticated inference engines capable of informing and even answering certain kinds of questions that the unaided human mind is known to have trouble with. For example, by identifying when two terms are being used interchangeably, when a single term is being used in multiple conflicting ways, when a relation between two concepts is likely to exist even though one has not yet been reported, and when the putative nomological network of a given concept contains internal inconsistencies. So it's a thoroughly pragmatic view, right? Like an ontology is useful to the degree that, well, essentially people claim it's useful and do something with it. Right? You can generate new ideas, you can identify points of miscommunication, but we shouldn't take these things as sort of, in any meaningful sense, like reflections of the world as it is. They're just very high-level approximations of low-order structure, and of course, like I do think, this sort of turns all the way down. You can sort of keep reducing as much as you like, but at the particular level they're comfortable with, and just say, this is a good enough description for us, and here's a good enough way of carving that space up. So I don't know if I'm over that time for questions, but I'm happy to stop and take questions for your time. Thank you.
So if you have a question, I'm going to hand you this microphone. And please don't start talking before you have the microphone, because otherwise I won't be able to hear you.
And then I get to answer whatever question I want.
Do I talk directly in here or
Yeah,
press the button?
No, you're
Okay.
fine.
Hey, hi, Tal. This is Chandra from University of Michigan. You might remember on Twitter, I think I did the sin that you were cautioning against, which is boasting about finding a parsimonious latent space that explains, a nice chunk of the variance in the data. And I appreciate the pushback, and that was helpful. And by the way, thank you for the terrific talk. I think I agree with almost all of it, but it's a little depressing at the same time. But I wanted to see if we're on the same page on this issue. There's sometimes a critique that's leveled against people that do dimensionality reduction, and the critique basically says, so what you found? You found a nice latent space there. Of course the method is going to do that. Gould sometimes says that about factor analysis and things like that. The point I guess I'm trying to make is that if I have a high-dimensional data set and I find a latent space that explains a substantial portion of the variance in the data, and I do due diligence in looking at out-of-sample reconstruction and things like that, I can have confidence in the dimensionality that's of that latent space, and furthermore, I can say this. I now know something really important about the data generating process. It's not that this algorithm was just guaranteed to converge and I got a result. It's the following. I now know that the data generating process is one that generates substantial amounts of covariance in the data. And it's not guaranteed that I'm going to find a low-dimensional space that explains a substantial amount of variance in the data. That only happens under very particular data-generating processes. So it is an important observation, not a final observation by any means, but an important observation to find these very highly explanatory latent spaces.
Yeah, so I broadly agree with that. I guess what I would say is a couple things. Number one, it's certainly not entailed, right, that you'll be able to reduce a high-dimensional space to a low-dimensional one and still preserve most of the variance, especially using the linear models that we typically do. That said, it is the case in almost every system you look at in psychology and neuroscience, right? So it's actually very rare. It could also be tend not to study those things because they seem incomprehensible, but it's actually quite rare to find systems that don't behave this way. The other thing is, I agree that that's an important point to demonstrate, but you only need to demonstrate it, once, twice, 3 times, right? So there's only so many times you can sort of decompose functional connectivity matrices before we know that. And we've known that for 15, 20 years now. And so that particular point, I think, sure, if you've identified an entire null domain of exploration, it's the first parcellation, I think that's an important point to make. Hey, look, 5 components will explain 92% of the variance. That's good to know. But if it's the 7th time someone's come along and said, I'm going to take the insula and I'm going to slightly tweak the method, and look, I still get 4-dimensional parcellation, and I just like this one because it carves it anterior, posterior, and not ventral to dorsal, then I kind of think, that may be useful if you can articulate a set of goals that justify that and not the 6th or 4th, but we don't tend to do that very often, right? So I'm with you that I'm not saying that it's not useful to demonstrate that decomposition methods do some work. And I'd even go further than that and say there are actually, you can come up with justifications if you're careful for why, like I showed you a particular paper we published. I'd like to think there's reasons for publishing that particular paper. But what it's not doing is it's not sort of providing any unique insight into, like, these are the joints at which nature is carved. And so, sure, there's utility, but if I take everything you said at face value, it's still the case that I think most of the work in this area is sort of just recycling those basic assumptions over and over again. So that's the worry.
Hey Tal, Felipe here. So thanks for a terrific talk. And I'm gonna ask a question that is like super duper philosophical. So bear with me because it involves a thought experiment. So there was I wanted to do a little bit of pushback on your claims about sort of replicability of some of the parcellation. And I wanted, it reminded me of an old discussion between Santiago Ramón y Cajal and Golgi. So when Golgi was sort of first staining neurons, he thought that spinal, that the spines in the dendrites were an artifact of the staining method. And so he said, like, there are no spines in dendrites. And Santiago Ramón y Cajal had the following argument. He said, like, well, if there are spines, then the probability of me finding these spines in using an entirely different staining method should be really, really low. He used an entirely different staining method, found the same spines, and that gave him, he thought, enough reason to believe that they were real. So here's the thought experiment. So far you have talked about replicability of functional parcellation strategies using relatively similar algorithms. So you have the Yao algorithm, so the Powers algorithm, the snowballing algorithm. So there's a family resemblance of those. But I wanted to think more radically. Suppose that someone invents, this is a thought experiment, another way of measuring metabolic activity in vivo that is completely different from Bolt signal. It doesn't rely on blood oxygenation or anything like that. It's something completely different. This is completely different from fMRI, but it just something like fMRI. And then someone comes across using this entirely new, different kind of method, does some sort of functional parcellation which is entirely different, and it gives you a resolution that, hey, look, and lo and behold, there is a saliency network. Two entirely different methods, not one based on Bolt signal, one based on something else, with very comparable resolutions. Would that give you, Tal Yarkoni, reason to believe that the saliency network is real?
So actually, I think we're going somewhere else with that. So let me answer the question I thought you were asking, because
that's probably a better question.
I don't, and it's sort of related to my previous answer, I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't use these methods, right? I think, again, I want to kind of harp on the point that the question is, like, how many times do you do essentially variation of the same thing? So if we discovered some brand new method that has great resolution, absolutely. I mean, a really good way to identify irregularities is to do some kind of decomposition. It's just that you have to keep in mind that if you kind of do this 3 or 4 times, it turns out, okay, sometimes you get this effect, sometimes you get that one. There's a point at which you probably want to stop and move on to the next thing. But clearly, it makes a lot of sense to decompose different kinds of data apart, different methods, et cetera, as long as you have some, I think, principal reason to think that's incrementally useful over time. Sorry, now I've actually forgotten what the question you did ask. What was the last sentence?
Oh, so the question was, imagine, I think that part of the concerns of doing these replications with different kinds of algorithms for functional parcellation is that maybe they're using all Bolt signal, but imagine that there is something that is not Bolt signal.
Yeah, so, right, so to come back to the example of the salience network, right, so it's not, again, I would never argue that there's no such thing as a salience network, right? The salience network is just, it's a perfectly good way to label a particular regularity. It's just that regularity is not sort of mutually exclusive from, like, 10 other networks that are overlapping, right? So you could talk about salience network if you find useful or something, But it's not like that precludes you talking about the dorsal attentional network, which is maybe the same thing, maybe slightly different, or the sort of object or sort of spatial manipulation network. So my point is not that I certainly don't suggest that all labels and all characterizations of the space are equally good. It's more that there's many, many, many good ways to talk about things, and you should be able to articulate why that one is useful for you, and not just assume that because someone once came up with this description of the salience network, that should hold for all time. Now, I will grant you that if it does turn out, and I've had discussions with Simon Eichhoff several times, Eichhoff thinks that long term we will actually identify a really nice isomorphic map. We just don't have the technology. So I'm happy to say if that turns out, sure. If it turns out that you can actually identify so many to carve up the things so that it immediately maps from anatomy to function, and you go all the way down to columns, then I will happily say that seems like we probably should actually use that as the scheme used to talk about things. I just see no reason at all to think that it's going to impact that way. I think all the data we've had to this point suggests that it's not. There are all these, it's a high-dimensional space that we just carve up in various ways. Let me also say one other thing related to your comment, which is part of what's really kind of frustrating about these kinds of approaches is there's the sense in which, let's say somebody did something radically different and got a very different answer. Nobody would believe it, right? So if I did a parcellation and it looked nothing like anything anyone had ever seen, they wouldn't say, oh, good, we've learned something really new and interesting. Everyone would say, well, you probably did something wrong, because you shouldn't get that, right? And so there's a sense you have this problem determining what is that, if you're heavily constrained by your priors, then it's the best you can ever do, in some sense, by using new clustering methods on new data, is slightly tweak the answer. But then often, 3 studies later, you kind of tweak it back in the other direction. So there's also this concern that we can get stuck in a local minimum. And maybe in support of your question, I think that the way we break out of these local minima is actually generally when new methods come along. It's not by sort of reanalyzing slightly different approaches, the same fMRI data. It's by waiting until the physicists actually come up with super fMRI, which has better resolution, and then you get this 5 to 10 year burst of really useful stuff, and then it's stagnates. But my feeling has always been that really the innovation is actually largely driven by the methods and the hardware, and the analysis stuff is in some sense the easy one. Whoever gets the first discovers interesting things, and then for 10 years you just do the same thing over and over again. That's my fairly good thing. But bottom line is I'm not suggesting that we should just say, job well done, let's all go home. I would actually probably agree with you that we should maybe focus our energy on identifying potentially entirely new sources of evidence and methods and so on, and focusing our energy there.
Okay. There were more hands.
Hey, Tal, Russ here. First, thanks for undercutting half my time. So, I think I heard you saying something, and I want to confirm whether this is what you were actually saying or not, or implying, because there's really high-dimensional stuff going on, and any projection of that, any sort of claim about structure at a lower dimension is simply epiphenomenal, simply sort of a statistical figment. Is that what you were really wanting to say?
Yeah, yes in a sense, but I think that gets at a much more general issue, right? So that really gets to the question of is any causation above whatever physics will ultimately suggest is the lowest level real? And I kind of want to say no. I do think that on some level, everything is epiphenomenal. It's not useful to talk about things that are, there's nothing you can do with that view beyond just say, because obviously we're not going to stop studying when we study. And the argument I think still has to be one for pragmatism, which is I can't compute anything even at the level of Newtonian mechanics or biochemistry. So there's not going to be a biochemistry of the human mind. But that's really, it really is a pragmatic argument. You can show me that this particular way of carving things up allows you to make predictions that this other way doesn't. I'm very happy with it. It's just that I suspect that because we are so far and so high up the ladder of the sciences, there are just going to be many, many, many reductions that are essentially functionally equivalent, right? So it's almost like pick the first one you want, and predictably it's going to be about the same kind of work. But I kind of want to brush off the sort of deep philosophical problem of causation. The view is, there's not really anything, there isn't any causation. I don't believe in sort of mental causation or high-level causation of any kind. But that's not, I think, a useful thing for scientists. You can't do anything with that, so.
I saw it in part my reaction is inspired by, thinking about sort of what we've learned from network science and sort of complexity science that shows that any complex system has stable organization at multiple scales, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, we can talk, obviously human societies you can think of as countries or cities or neighborhoods or whatever. And those aren't, those are all sort of, very reasonable ways to think about organization, and they're all real in some sense. So I guess I come down to the feeling that there doesn't have to be one level at which we say, this is the level at which the joints are carved and every other level is sort of phenomenal. It's interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think so. I mean, there's a breadth versus trade-off, right? So you can talk about, you can identify entities that are more relevant to predicting, or relevant to predicting more different kinds of phenomena, or you can have models that predict things more accurately, but don't generalize very well. I think that's the general trade-off. And again, I don't want to suggest that, I'm really very careful. I'm not suggesting that there aren't stronger and weaker regularities. I think it makes sense to talk about the amygdala as a functional unit. Of course, a systems neuroanatomist would say, well, the amygdala really isn't just one thing, right? There's all these nuclei, they're fuzzy, but there's clearly irregularity there that you wouldn't get if you just split it in half. It's better to talk about the amygdala in almost every respect you like than to just talk about an arbitrary collection of voxels that happen to include some amygdala voxels. But my point is more that I think we hit, because there's so much structure there, and because our methods haven't improved that much, I think we identified sort of the major points of variation, at least at the level of MRI, pretty early on. I haven't seen many new sort of regularities identified in the last 10, 15 years. It's not to say that we haven't identified really useful ways of talking about the rate we have. We haven't improved much, I would say, right, in the last 10 years. I feel like, so a parcellation that has 200 networks and maybe sort of chips away at this regional observability, it's not really, I don't think it's actually changing the way we think about the world in a meaningful way. It's just sort of one additional thing you can publish in some sense. That wasn't true in 1995, when almost anything you did was actually identify an interesting new structure that nobody knew about. But the favorite, we've talked about this before, my favorite example is the dorsal medial PXC. I don't think anybody would have ever predicted there's some medial frontal region that looks like it's sensitive social stuff. It's a fuzzy thing, good luck describing exactly what that means, but there is some regularity that's really interesting. But I don't think we've advanced our understanding of it anyway in 10, 15 years. So I'm not suggesting that everything is equally, it's not a postmodernist view that you just tell the story you want. It's more that we should try and identify whether the improvement, whether we're actually improving on the stories we've been telling in a way that justifies all the effort and money that we're spending on these methods.
Totally.
Hi, Tal. Carl Kraber here from TNP. How's it going? Nice talk. I guess my question is really very general, and it's about, we're talking about cognitive ontology here, but I was wondering if anything that you said was really about cognitive ontology, or was it about ontology quite generally? And when we think about the cell, if we had rewound the clock 200 years, would it have been reasonable to say of the cell that it's just a busy buzzing confusion in any attempt to break it into a nucleus and a cytoplasm and an endoplasmic reticulum would be some sort of error? And similarly for the rest of the body and the organs, do you think that those are also conventional, pragmatic distinctions? Or is there something distinctive about the mind that makes it especially problematic in your mind, in your view, to carve things at their joints?
So let me qualify my answer by saying that my knowledge of biology is very, very limited. So I don't know. Right? So it's possible, so it's able to do that. Yeah, we're just in early days, and maybe 50 years down the road, it turns out we actually have sort of a well understood way of dividing things up. That said, I'm skeptical. Right? There is a sense in which, if you look at a cell under a microscope with the right resolution, there are structures that sort of jump out at you. Not to say there isn't ambiguity, you couldn't have described it somewhat differently, but I think you don't have sort of the same level of fuzziness. And I think that's just intrinsic to it's not anything about the mind being special or biology being special. I think it's just the complexity of the system. And the same would be true of, economies or group dynamics. I think whatever you can say about the brain, whatever structure, however difficult it is to talk about structure at the level of fMRI data, it's way harder to do the equivalent thing at the level of social dynamics. I can't even imagine what it would look like to sort of isolate or do cluster analysis of social dynamics. Like, what would the data even look like? So I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that it's the mind. I do think it's the fact that you're sort of progressively abstracting away from sort of very, from physical systems to chemical ones to biological ones to supra-individual ones. And that to me is really the critical thing. But, I mean, it'd be great if I'm wrong with that 50 years from now. Yeah, it turns out that it just took us a really long time, but it turns out that in fact the mind does have very clear joints, and just like the cell. But I'm not holding my breath, yes.
Hey, Tal, it's Chandra again. I wonder what you think about the following, which is that one use of dimensionality reduction, I think you're right to point out the kind of, I don't know if the word is hubris involving use, is when you do a dimensionality reduction and you look at the way, you find some low dimensional space, you look at the axes, you start reifying things, and you say these are the entities in our ontology. That's one whole kind of use of these methods. There's another whole use of these methods that actually appeals to humility and not hubris at all. And it goes like this. You know that the 5-minute, a single connection in a 5-minute fMRI has horrendous test-retest reliability to the level of being unacceptable for studying individual differences. And Russ's recent self-regulation ontology paper says that, behavioral tests are similar. And you move to all different kinds of modalities, and we've been very arrogant to think that we can see, fine-grained structure of anything. And so it's a good idea to trade in 100,000 noisy features, none of which are actually reliably measurable, for, let's say, 200 features. And I will concede that it tells us nothing about the ontology, but it's 200 features that at least we can see again and again, and that's the unit of resolution that we should be operating in. What do you think of that? I
completely agree. I think the statistical argument for dimensionality reduction is very clear. And that's why kind of towards the end where I said, I'm a big fan of pushing sort of prediction as something you should care more about. And one thing that's nice about framing things that way is there's a very clear benefit formally, right? To sort of, if you have a finite amount of data, there is a trade-off between the complexity of the model and stability of the model. So if you can do dimensionality reduction, capture most of the variance with a much smaller number of predictors, then your model estimates are probably going to be more robust. The key there, though, is that's true so long as you state that your goal is to build a better predictive model. And the point I was making is, clustering analyses and so on tend not to be published because, hey, I can explain 6% of the variance in this outcome and the last one did 5.4. They tend to be published because we think we're getting insight. So I completely agree with you. And so from a machine learning standpoint, that's exactly why you do dimensional reduction. It's just it's like getting some better features. You can pack more stuff in there with the same amount of predictors. But that's a very different kind of application from the scientific one of trying to understand sort of what the joints in the system are. And I think that's really a tough proposition to get at that by doing dimensionality reduction.
We have time for one more question.
Not so much a question, but I guess just a point. When you were talking about Dennett and real patterns, you sounded like you wanted to apologize as if finding a real pattern we're not really finding something. That pattern existence is not really existence. But part of what I think is interesting in Dennett is that he wants to claim that pattern existence is all you get. And so I guess I just want to point out, no need to apologize. And then the question is, should you be a skeptic about these ontologies or should you be a pluralist about them? Because it might be the case that there are many patterns hiding in the system that we're interested in.
Yeah, I think I'm only apologizing in the sense that I guess it's a little bit like a fuck you, right? It's like if you're not going to get more than this, I'm sorry. That's so I think I agree with that on that point. I I think you should be a pragmatist, but so whether you should be pluralist depends on what your goals are. So again, if you are in a situation where you just need some parcellation because, to follow up on the last question, maybe your goal is you don't have that much data, you want to build a predictive model to predict some other outcome, and you can't pack into 1,000 voxels, so you just need some dimensional reduction. Well, it turns out you can basically take random blobs in the brain and you probably do almost as well with as any other parcellation. So if that's essentially what you could say, sure, be a pluralist, take the first one, it doesn't matter. You could also have, but you could alternatively have some, like if you're focused on some particular domain, maybe you're interested in, I don't know, long-term memory. And there's lots of different ways to understand long-term memory. You could start fleshing out these ontologies, and maybe you can identify some argument for saying something like, well, you know, in general, like this particular looking at things is not as scientifically productive as this other one, so maybe you want to pick this one over that one. Yeah, my answer to almost every question is it depends on what your goals are. Basically, a pragmatist in every respect. Like if you can show me there's some reason to favor a particular orientation, good for you. I don't have a strong position on whether you should want one ontology, 50 of them, whether it matters at all. What I do have a strong position on is if you think that what you are going to get at the end of the day is deep insight into sort of ground truth and nicely parsed things like that, I think is not realistic.
All right.
All right, let's